Okay, so at the beginning, I would like to thanks for the invitation, and hello, Tatiana, and maybe I will be reading, because what I want to say is quite precise, so I need to help with my text. So maybe I will start with some personal reference. It was during my excursion to Kharkiv in 2015, full of interesting meetings, when I fully discovered the phenomenon of Kharkiv School of Photography. And my stay in Kharkiv was at the moment when the future of the city was still uncertain. The Russian invasion was still probable. So the context of history appeared to me quite visibly. And I realized that, as Peter Pomerantsev put it in his article, Kharkiv, City of Vagabonds and Poets, that appeared in 2015 in Politico magazine, that the essence of that city lies also in what could be called instability. And Pomerantsev quoted local psychologists who told that, as for 2015, the usual principles of psychology no longer applied here. Our job is to bring our patients back to reality, but how can we do that when there is no common reality? When Russia might invade at any moment and you don't know what the next day will bring. Pomerantsev remark, as well as my personal experience during the trip, lead me to more general reflection that Kharkiv, as a city, but also as some constellation of artists, may be seen as a privileged observation point. It means to me that for that observation point, history becomes more visible. And my thesis is that Boris Mikhailov and Evgeny Pavlov, who are the subject of my interest here, are both deeply involved in the question of history. But of course, I don't mean here its simple documentary understanding, rather a complicated tangle of crucial questions. The first, how to give a visual shape to the experience of history. Second, how to bring together affects and images. And finally, how to decolonize the photographic medium, deeply marked by propaganda and degradation of its language. So my research question here is, can photography as a medium may be seen as a privileged tool of delay? It means amateur or artistic historiographical reflection, and also a very fundamental anthropological remark that photography, as perceived by Mikhailov and Pavlov, visualize the instability of historical experience and at the same time the instability and ephemeral character of photographic medium as such. This dialectical ability of the photography was recognized and used by members of Kharkiv School. And now I will go to Boris Mikhailov, and I will start with two quotes that to go with the interview David Tabur made with him. The first one: I had a special Russian camera. I would take photos without looking through the lenses. The camera was on my belly, and I would shot from my belly. And I shot from my belly. The camera has a lens that won't show the horizon straight, and this uneven collapsing horizon produced a picture that is collapsing, like the country. The two coincide. And the second quote: one period is collapsing and other is beginning, when one thing and the opposite existed at the same time. It was this zero moment that I saw. And much like a sensitive seismographs of history, Mikhailov's and Pavlov's photographs record the process of a downfall, the gradual disintegration of the imperial order and its language. The destruction of a history is accompanied here by the disintegration of a way of seeing, the collapse of principles that govern the photographic image. Photography is a perfect reflection of the formless moment of the historical experience. The camera has the ability to catch red-handed the gradual collapse of the horizon of shared history. As historian Hayden White wrote, I opened a quotation, Historians always have problems with transitional moments in the histories of their subjects. It is also because a transition is precisely what cannot be represented in any medium, because it is what happens between two states considered to be relatively stable. And this moment cannot be represented because it has the same status as a blank space that divides two frames of a movie film. The moment in which something becomes something else, or something other than what it had earlier been, cannot be represented through verbal or visual images, because this moment is precisely a moment of the absence of presence, the moment at which one presence is drained of its substance and filled with another. And on any scientific account of this phenomenon, it must be said that such a moment is overdetermined to be the subject of explanation. End of quotation. And going back to Boris Mikhailov, it was an in-between period. It was a moment when I realized the importance of what Benjamin said. Dreams are transformed into kitsch. Everything has turned gray. It's about nothing, nothing. Mikhailov commented on his work at the time of perestroika. The negativity here is more than just the obvious negation of the official propaganda language. It is falling into time, the process of accelerating history, a new unknown horizon whose color is no longer red. At the same time, photography, same like the invisible radioactive cloud, is problematized here as a tool that annihilates the reality it depicts, carrying with it death and ultimate collapse. The affirmation of nothingness signifies not only the photographer's acceptance of the disintegration of his world, but also the acceleration of this process through the use of photography. However, nothingness and decay are not the end. They are different names for that which is unknown and yet to be described. 1 year before the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, Mikhailov made perhaps his most famous series, Unfinished Dissertation. In this work, images and words coexist on an equal level. The dissonance between these two elements, like the inflation of words and images appropriated and subsequently abandoned by ideology, reflects the chaos of the USSR in decline. As wrote Tamara Hundarova, quotation, "In the absence of an essence or an ontologically constant center, humans construct themselves and their world using a language disconnected from the words of object." End of quotation. Unfinished Dissertation is a treatise on the incompatibility of words and things, words and images, a treatise on a human experience that is coming unstuck from language and ideology, as well as a story about the decline of the photographic aura. One of the first comments opening Unfinished Dissertation is a quotation from Walter Benjamin Traumkitsch. "The dream no longer reveals the blue horizon. Everything is gray now. The dream has evolved into the road towards banality." Benjamin's archaeology of communal dreams is a vision of disillusion. By juxtaposing these words with photographs of Soviet life, Mikhailov shows their other meaning. It's also an attempt at the multi-layered interweaving of photography and color, lending this combination, photography and color, a historiographical meaning. Such a phenomenological reading requires us to understand that color always has meaning and is always political. Quotation, "After 13 years of absence, when I first returned to the Soviet Union in 1988, nothing struck me more than the disappearance of the color red from the streets of Moscow. And with this discoloration of red, other colors emerge in a competition to become the pigmentation of a new epoch," recalls Margarita Tupichin in her text on Boris Mikhailov. This remarkable observation shifts the emphasis onto the political existential dimension of color, which, it is often forgotten, is a social fact. The inherent paradox of color is that it usually remains invisible. As anthropologist Michael Taussig puts it, we so rarely see color unless it hurts us and offends us. Color passes us by in the same way in which we do not notice our own breathing until it stops. This organic trait of color, its similarity to breathing, its direct association with our being in the world, make it difficult to see. Color passes us by also means that it harmonizes with our emotions, our affects, and is frequently the most intimate form of memory. It is a mood and impalpable aura left by things and people, but also by the constellation of events and times known as history. Boris Mikhailov has devoted more attention to colors than probably any other photographer. From his earliest work in 60s and 70s, colors have played a decisive role in his work. Mikhailov appears to imply that every era, every decade has its own color. It is the photographer's duty to pick out that pattern because photography as a medium that is particularly sensitive to light has the capacity to capture nuances of color. Mikhailov leads us from red, in Red series, the official color of the Soviet Empire visual propaganda, through gray in Unfinished Dissertation, the color of low contrast, black and white photographic print, often poorly developed and with technical imperfections, associated here with amnesia, short-term memory loss, or the inability to see colors, and finally to blue in At Dusk, clearly identified here with the post-Soviet, post-imperial melancholy of the time after the end of history. The images of human misery and decay in urban Kharkiv that comprise the series At Dusk are tinted blue, produce a depressing effect. It is worth noted that in traditional black and white photography, the film emulsion is most sensitive to blue light. Mikhailov's photos quite literally serve as a kind of sensitive seismograph that reveals the colors of history in the darkroom. Naturally, an excess of blue can also be a result of technical error, the underexposure of the image and the absence of other colors. It's a fundamental flaw that obstructs and distorts our view of the depicted world, an imperfection permanently associated, as Mikhailov implies, with the post-Soviet reality. Blue for me is the color of the blockade, of hunger and war, Mikhailov said. But we should remember that historically, blue is another form of black, a kind of in-between color, a transitional, faulty color. The film director, Derek Jarman, who gradually lost his sight while he was dying of AIDS-related complications, and in the end saw everything in shades of blue. This triggered in him a particularly acute sensitivity to color. It was then that he wrote Chroma, a book of colors, and made monochromatic blue video film entitled Blue. It was 1994, more or less the same year when Mikhailov made At Dusk. Blue, the last color he could discern, his final mood, the color filter of death, a kind of monochromatic transition to the other side. The same with Mikhailov. His blue-tinted world contains echoes of the afterlife and certainly something of the in-between space haunted, as in Yesterday's Sandwich, by specters that cannot break free of the aura of the place in which they are forced to live, irradiated by a peculiar sensitivity to color. Now I jump to Evgeny Pavlov and start with his Selfie with My Wife. This is a photograph from the year 1988, which forms part of the Total Photography series. It's not in the album, but it's one of the photos that is a part of series Total Photography. This is a double expanded self-portrait where we see Evgeny Pavlov and his wife Tatiana Pavlova. The visual power of this photo is augmented by its historical context. Selfie is created during the Perestroika period, an era which Svetlana Alexievich named the beginning of the end of the Red Man. Much like a sensitive seismograph of history, Pavlov photographs record the process of downfall, the disintegration of the imperialistic Soviet order, and at the same time, the disintegration of a way of seeing. A woman and a man, husband and wife, look at us as if from afar, from beneath of a layer of color imposed onto the emulsion. This strange impression of a different dimensions of time seems to show the ruins of an image, the ruins of a time, of history, and ruins of empire. It is only thanks to the gaze we focus on them. Selfie with My Wife remains an image of seismography of history. The other project made by Evgeny Pavlov, his book Dom Byta, English title Home Life Book, this book, is a completely different way of looking at the shared life, at the perestroika area and the time of political transformation. All the photos used by Pavlov in the Home Life book are black and white in comparing to total photography. Lacking strong contrast, dazzling with their perfect grayness, in this case, less of a symptom for what is Soviet or life within a monochromatic totalitarian reality, but rather the sign of temporal distance and the work of memory whose distance obliterates the most radical of extremes, effaces contours and cools the emotions down. This is about the long end of a certain era and the fleeting beginning of a new one, about the strange time and space in between. Indeed, taken over a period of 3 decades, from 1975 to 2002, Pavlov's photographs bear few direct traces of the political transformation. In a way, Pavlov's stories are an attempt at placing oneself within history, but also outside of its mainstream narratives. The empty space that divides two frames of a film mentioned by Hayden White in this quotation at the beginning of my speech. If there is a metaphor capable of rendering the relation these photographs have with history, with the order of historical experience, then this one seems most adequate. Against historians, whose means often prove incapable of grasping the temporary character of experience, with the evasiveness of its ending and the unclarity of its beginning. So a paradox, an impossible place, a touch of the utopian. There are the spaces and figures of experience wherein Pavlov historical narratives are located. They mark his artwork, and they are also marked by the absence of presence, which remains so problematic for the researcher constructing his narrative, and yet so fascinating for a photographer. The photographs which make up Home Life book, Dom Byta, were taken between the years 1975-2002, but they only gained their final book form many years later in 2013. Here, the retardation is significant. The return to these photos years later makes for a displacement of those emotions. This dialectic is essential here. Home Life book is firstly and foremost a story about the everyday life of the photographer and his family in the reality of the late Soviet Union, and later in that of the newly founded Ukraine. It is a story of the shared life of people and things in the Soviet and post-Soviet landscape. The sociological character of the photos may be significant in the dimension of testimony, but what comes to the fore is what can be called the existential dimension. The problem is already signaled in the equivocal title. Dom Byta is house of being or place of residency, but it is also somehow the daycare center, a place of isolation that the whole Soviet Union would metaphorically turn into, and later all the entire post-Soviet space. Simultaneously, it is also worth remembering that there is a reverse side to this image, the topos of the house as a motherland. One image, one can also find the echoes of philosophical references in the Dom Byta, which direct us toward Heideggerian categories of being and dwelling, both so important for Pavlov's book. Photography would then certainly become a way of tracing the mark of his dwelling, and in a way a celebration of the world's visibility as such. Pavlov's book intertwines autobiography with meta-thoughts on what remains crucial for the project, and what is inscribed to the double logic that governs the book is the figure of the photographer's wife. The author of text accompanying the photos is not Evgeny, but Tatiana. It isn't the photographer, but his wife. While the subjective associative composition of photos seems to evoke memory's ways of working with its gaps and repetitions, in spite of being irregular, Tatiana's Pavlova's commentaries give the book a structure, an order which becomes a barrier. I will show you the photos and commentaries. Tatiana Pavlova's commentaries gives the book a structure, an order which becomes a barrier and something to lean against in face of passing flow of time. It is an arrest, a pausing, always executed from the position of a temporal and critical distance, from the position of a historian and critic who shows these photographs their place within the history of photography and within critical order. Finally, she does so from the position of woman, the artist's wife, who is simultaneously inside the project and outside of it, in a place where images become part of discourse. The photographer's wife is just a distancing figure, a medium for alienating these very personal photographs from a personal history, for the sake of a history which can be ours, a history which transforms the I into we, and which transforms affects into a temporal distance narrative. It places a subjective series of photos within a network of references created by someone who operates with a different set of linguistic references rather than visual ones. The photographer's wife would thus take on an in-between position. She would belong to the transitory phase of history, lost somewhere between the personal and the historic, the affective and the narrative. In Home Life book, it isn't a question of co-creating, but rather a complex juxtaposition of two orders, the visual and the textual order, the affective and the critical one, the masculine and the feminine, and finally the order linked with the I and the order of the we. These orders constantly intertwine and diverge. Two seemingly incompatible language, the affective or expressive one and the critical one, loop within the Home Life book. But it is but is it ever possible to definitely separate them? In his book devoted to Camille Zida, Jean Narboni underscores that Roland Barthes always confesses of his discomfort whenever he is forced to separate two languages, one that would be critical and the other that would be expressive. This discomfort appears when he turns toward the past, trying to understand the bonds between history and our history. History by capital H and our history. When we start to speak about what once was and discover that, as Gilles Deleuze put it, emotions do not speak the I. The extraordinary character of Home Life book resides in the fact that it is situated in the very middle of these cuts and tensions that are difficult to reconcile, somewhere between the I and the we, between emotion and distance, between history and effort to escape it, within the empty space that separates two frames of film. So Home Life book could be seen as a form of transitional photo-autobiography, where personal story of photographer's family becomes something much wider, kind of reflection on transitional moment of history and about relation between what is affective or subjective and what is discursive in writing history and in photography itself. And going to conclusion, so for the final conclusion, I would say that in contrast to the historians who cite with facts as a matter of principle, the photographer seems to be constantly intermediating between facts and affects, belonging to an impossible space, the 0 point, which I take from what Mikhailov said once. From this perspective, a photographer talks about the color of history rather than about history itself. And this is the case of both Boris Mikhailov and Evgeny Pavlov. And one of the reasons Mikhailov's and Pavlov's photographic projects are so powerful is that they are located in an impossible utopian space, attesting to the beginning of the end of the era and then to its actually end, reflecting the collapse of a certain historical order. They themselves produce a kind of visual photographic experience that, like Georges Bataille's notion of formless, deforms our notion of history, investing it with ever new meanings. I've got also an impression that in both cases, in case of both photographers, it is the photography itself we could call home, even if it's haunted home. Thank you. That's all.